Okay, so what I'd like to do is take a few of Josh's ideas and expand on them a little bit. And it's a little bit different perspective than you may have had before, because I'm coming to you from the other side of the table. We all like to build on our infrastructure on our farm, but what happens sometimes is that we don't look at all the different possibilities before we make a decision. The number one question I get when I go to a farm or talk to somebody at a meeting like this is, what kind of fence do I need for my farm? And my head is full of lots of different ideas. We've got wood fence, we've got plastic fence, we've got wire fence, we've got portable fences, we've got permanent fences, we've got electric fences. And at the end of the conversation, what it basically boils down to is, how well do you sleep at night? Do you worry a lot? Do you lose sleep? Do you have some high-value animals you need to protect? Do you have some high-value equipment you're trying to protect? Because it's not always just the farm that we're talking about. The question comes up, how much security do you need? Are we talking about being careful of or being aware of just our livestock? Are we being careful of, again, our equipment, our investment in our farm? Are we talking about our kids and our pets? I probably shouldn't put them in the same sentence, but that's often the way it works out. We want to take a look at how durable we need this fence to be. Okay, are we looking at something that happens over a long period of time, or are we talking about a very shorter investment in this particular project? Always, there is a bottom line. We need to make sure that we've put enough thought into going into the project that we can make it an affordable thing. We don't want it to break the budget. We don't want it at the end of the project or at the end of the 5 or the 10-year lifespan of the fence for you to think, well, it really wasn't worth it. Safety is sometimes a concern, not only with dealing with the livestock, but maybe we've got traffic and we've got the public concerns. There's lots of different things we need to look at in this conversation as we go forward. And then there's always the appearance of the fence. This is something that you're going to have to live with for a while, and we want to make sure that what we leave you with at the end of the day is something that you can be happy with. So let's start off with security to begin with. Basically, it breaks down into two different categories. Are we keeping something in, or are we keeping something out? Or in fact, are we actually doing both? There are always some layers to the answer. Now, in this case, what we've done is we've taken a horse fence. We put it around a yard by the house, and what we're doing is we're keeping kids and dogs safe from driveways and roads. So we've taken about 3 different aspects of what we want to achieve and brought them all together into one successful fence. But if you had decided to do it yourself and you called the co-op, your fence supply store, and you said, I want a horse fence, maybe nobody would ever have thought that you needed it for your kids. So that was a 4-foot high fence. Next step up from that would be a 5-foot high fence. Basically, it's the same material, slightly improved level of security because you've got that much more fence to work with. And in this case, it's a place where they do agility training for dogs. The other advantage of thinking ahead is this is something that's going to be used in the wintertime. And so as the snow builds up, you've still got lots of fence to work within. Taking that a little bit further yet, let's talk about a 6-foot high fence. Again, you're taking those same animals, those dogs in this case, and you're confining them to an even smaller space. So it's a matter of thinking, what is my end goal? What do I want this fence to achieve for me? And perhaps you would never think about putting that kind of fence on your farm, but it does illustrate the point that it takes that thought process ahead of time. Let's take it one step further. There's a deer fence, 7 feet high. What it does basically is it keeps the deer safe on one side, keeps the people safe and separated from the deer on the other side. So again, maybe it's not something you ever would have thought of, maybe something you wouldn't use in a pasture situation, but it illustrates the point that you need to get the end purpose of that fence in your head before you start moving forward. The other thing we have to think about security-wise on the farm specifically is what kind of density are we talking about? We're talking about a lot of animals being confined in a very small space for a period of time, or are we talking about something more like that, where you put a horse, you put some animals out into a very expansive area, but maybe bring them in every day. They'd only go out for exercise and a little bit of a meal. When you think about these things ahead of time, you can make those valuable decisions as far as what kind of fence is going to work the best for you. We always do have problems to consider security-wise, especially with the sheep. And as Josh mentioned, there's lots of these guys around. Excuse me. Sometimes what we need to do is change the way we think about animals like this, predators like this. If you talk to the M&R guys, they'll actually tell you that the best way to protect your sheep from coyotes, if you've got a coyote in the area, is to leave them there. Because they are territorial, they have certain behaviors and instincts. And if you can use those natural instincts to your advantage, then you can get away with actually less fencing. Same thing with deer, actually. It's interesting that if you've got a deer problem on your farm and you want to keep them off the farm, remove the landmark that they use to enter your farm. So maybe that means going out and taking a tree down. If you follow their trails, you can see where they've been entering your farm for a period of time. Or if there's a stone there, often it's something very simple like that, like a landmark. If you take that landmark out of the way, then the deer will walk right past your farm looking for it again. Then there's somebody else's problem. The other thing we often do too is we think about our fence being our security and protecting our livestock, but again, we always have to stay smarter than guys like this. And sometimes that means adding an extra layer and having dogs or llamas or whatever, some kind of protection or alarm system on the inside as well. There's another case where we're sort of combining one fence to do two different purposes. We've got the kids on the one side, on the right, and horses on the outside. So there's a live wire out there. We've combined the electric side of things with the physical properties of that fence. And then putting the top rail on the top like we did in this one just kind of makes it a little less institutional looking. Again, let's step up security a little bit more. Not something you're likely to have on your farm, but in fact, in this purpose, it's exactly what they needed. So we spent some time, we talked about the different possibilities. This is the decision that was made. It's going through this conversation, like I am with you right now, get those ideas, get that understanding out, and those expectations out. Again, just one more level. So that fence serves a purpose to this individual, just as your fence will serve your purpose on your farm, regardless of what that fence ends up looking like. When we sit down, too, we've got to talk about the durability and the duration of this fence. A lot of the materials that we're using nowadays are very long-lived materials. We can expect, 20 years, basically 10 to 20 years of good use out of that fence with a little bit of maintenance and care. The biggest problem often on a fence to consider is how hard are the animals on the fence? Do they like to rub on it? Do they like to chew on it? Do they like to run into it? And how do we address those issues when it comes down to making the decision what kind of fence to make? We need to talk about how long we need the fence to last. Are we talking about a very short duration fence like in an annual grazing situation? Or are we talking about, I think Jack's going to talk this afternoon about starting a brand new pasture. So getting into a long-term investment into that pasture, you want to make sure that your fence is going to last as long as well. Or, like I say, at the opposite end, maybe we're just doing some annual grazing, or grazing some annual crops, I should say. And you only need that fence to last a very short duration because the next year it could be back into some kind of another crop. Often we have, as far as durability and duration, we need to consider the snow loads on your farm, sometimes the landscape on your farm. Different things like that, we need to, again, sit down and make those decisions right at the very beginning so that you make your best investment. Flooding's another issue. Often this time of year, we'll see rivers and streams come up to the point where they wash out sections of fence. Is that something we need to build into the decision to begin with? Maybe have a removable section that we can pull out when that situation occurs. We've talked about horses a little bit. Horses have a very, very specific need. They have both a visual need to see where that fence is, but again, they like to chew. They like to rub. So we often, with a horse fence, what we'll do is we'll add in a electrical component. So in that case, we got the wide band on top. The horses can see where their perimeter is. With the electric wires underneath, they're less likely to rub and chew on the fence. Similar aspect with a different set of materials. A lot of this stuff comes in black and white, and sometimes brown. And then it becomes a personal choice for the owner. Do they want something that often matches the trim on the house? Something as simple as that. Same place in a slightly different design. In this case, there'd be horses on both sides of that alleyway, and the owner felt that there should be a little more security there. Sheep are another concern that we often have in this area. We like to have a good, solid perimeter fence like that with some close spacings on the wire. Often what we'll do is down about this height, we'll put another live wire to keep the sheep from rubbing on the fence, keep the wool where it belongs until you're ready to take it off. And when we have identified the predator issue in this area, we'll often put a live wire on the top. And sometimes, if it's really bad, we'll put a live wire on the bottom, both on the outside of the fence, so that when the predators come up, stops them from climbing up the outside of the fence, stops them from digging underneath, or at least it helps to stop them. Because coyotes can be very, very ingenious. But having that good physical barrier there to begin with really goes a long way to making the whole system work. Once you get inside the perimeter of the farm, and you want to make a good rotation out of your pastures, you'll often need laneways. So the next step down from a perimeter fence on the interior of a farm is to go with, say, a smooth wire fence like that that's electrified. That carries the power to the back of the farm, allows you to then progress to the next stage, which is then when you're building your divisions, you can go to something very light, very flexible, like a poly wire and step-in posts. Each time you step down from a level of security, you also keep a little more money in your pocket because it becomes less and less expensive and more of a tool that you use on a daily basis. Cattle need a little more security as well. They typically will go with a physical barrier like an 8-wire or a 9-wire fence with a live wire on top again. And maybe, depending on the application, one about halfway up. Putting that live wire on there just gives that animal that added psychological barrier, and it also keeps them from rubbing and pushing on the fence over the years. In this case, where there is a lot of pressure on those animals because it's in a confinement area, you definitely want to keep your fence up a little bit higher as well. There's another cattle fence with much less pressure on it. It's a big 60-acre field. So instead of going with the heavy-duty woven wire on the outside, we've gone just with a 6-wire electrified. You notice that only the alternate wires are insulated. The other wires are actually grounded, so that if those animals are out in the wintertime and standing on a bit of snow, they can still get a good shock from the fence. And we can talk about fencers, we can talk about grounding. Lots of places we can go with a conversation, but basically that fence gives that individual the security that he needs to get through the night. And, you know, 6 wires may seem a lot for a lot of cattle farms as well. We've also built 3-wire and 4-wire and 5-wire. But again, it gets back to that notion that it's whatever makes you feel comfortable, whatever, if you've had a disaster in the past, you maybe want to go a little bit heavier next time. But it's a matter often of personal choice. Another 6-wire fence. In this case, actually, they're non-electrified. And all we were doing was keeping the snowmobilers off the farm. Which again, often a consideration. Not on every farm, but on many of the farms that we run into in this area. There is still a fair bit of the old 9-gauge woven wire around. A lot of the farms up this way were built with 9-gauge in the past, and it is still available for the guys that like it. There's quite a variation in the cost. There's quite a variation in the amount of galvanizing that's on the wire, and there's quite a variation in the amount of strength. The newer high tensile woven wires are actually a lot better quality than they were even 15 years ago. The first ones that came out were built just a little bit too stiff, and when we got the snow loads that we typically get around here, we got a lot of breakage. Now they've taken some of the carbon out of the steel and they've made them a little more pliable. But the high tensile woven wires still stand up to our snow loads here a lot better than the old style 9-gauge. The 9-gauge wires, the old-fashioned page wire, still a lot of guys like to see it on the farms because that's what their fathers had and that's what their grandfathers had. So we're willing to work with them on those cases. I mentioned snow loads. Sometimes we get into a situation where it's a real consideration. The individual on the right had us build the fence, but did not want his fence bottom cleared out whatsoever. The individual on the right happens to have 80 acres of open ground to the west. And so any snow that did come flying through there caught in that fence bottom and landed right on top of the fence. We were lucky enough what we ended up building there was a smooth wire high tensile fence. So that in the spring when we found this, the staples had pulled from the fences, the staples had broken if they hadn't let go. It was an easy enough fence to pick up and put back together. Had it been a woven wire fence, it wouldn't have been the same thing whatsoever. We would have just rolled it up, thrown it away, and started again. Definitely snow plows are no fun for a fence, especially when the fence needs to be very close to the road or in the ditch. Often we'll try to move it back a little bit, but if you don't like giving away too much land either. And I think sometimes the operators of the snow plows just like to see, it's just a test, right? I mentioned too that location is sometimes a big consideration. This is right at the bottom of the Blue Mountains up in Collingwood, and literally that much snow can fall overnight. We're in the midst of this application, this installation, and this is a recurring event for them. So again, the choice of fence that we use was important. Flooding sometimes an issue, especially with electrified fences. If that live wire ends up underwater, then it'll short the fencer out, take down the whole system. Chances are it's not a permanent thing, but we also mentioned sometimes, especially this time of year, we get into flooding from creeks and rivers. And again, sometimes it's the topography that we need to be most concerned about. The nice part about this job was that we didn't have to fence one side of the field. It's just a sheer rock wall that's up in Owen Sound. Budget-wise, chances are if you've called me and you want me to come and give you a price on a fence, I'm going to ask you for a fairly sizable investment in your property. Okay? You have to decide before we go too far what level of investment you are happy with making. Bert Orgenwine told me years ago that you cannot build a fence on a farm that will decrease the value of that farm. When the time comes to sell that farm, you've opened up that, by having a fence on there, you've opened up that farm to a new bunch of buyers. It's not just a cash crop farm anymore. If it's got a fence, there's somebody with a livestock farmer looking for a farm that's already fenced. So it is a good investment to make. Sometimes it's a sizable investment, sometimes not so much. Sometimes it's easy to do. But you have to kind of decide that with the project that you have in mind, is this investment worthwhile, or should you be thinking about something else? Again, is it a short-term thing or a long-term thing? Are we starting a new pasture that you want to get some long-term value out of, or is this just an annual crop or an annual crop that you want to graze and then move on to something else later on? Those are two very different scenarios. Another question sometimes comes up, is the land owned or is it leased? If you own your land, then it's not as big of a decision because you know that you're going to make those changes within your own principles. But if you're trying to think about building a fence on leased land, you want to make sure that you have an opportunity to get that investment back out. So often we end up with seeing that either the cost of the fence becomes part of the rent or part of the lease payment, or at the end of the lease agreement, there's some kind of compensation for that fence. And you got to ask yourself too, how are your plans going to change over the life of this fence, over the life of this investment? Are you going to say, okay, I've got to get it all out right at the front end, or is this something that I can, put off or delay the final payment till later on? Think about how your plans might change. Appearances of this fence are important as well. What do you want to have to look at for the next 10 to 20 years, or perhaps even longer, with a bit of maintenance and care? How is it going to affect the value of your farm, and can you get that investment back out? Bottom line there, at the end of the project, I get to leave, and you have to stay. So your decisions, your input into the whole decision process and this conversation is much more important than mine. As a contractor, I try to make sure you don't make any mistakes along the way or end up unhappy with it. But inevitably, you're the one that, like I said, has to stay. So we get into different kinds of fences in situations like this. A fence like that functions not only as a property marker, but it contains the horse as part of the year. We did a fence last year for a couple in London who really didn't like their neighbors. Just did not get along at all. And so we built them a fence that was within an inch of the property line and within an inch of the absolute highest allowed by the bylaws. And you can stand just about anywhere now, and they don't have to see their neighbors. Again, it's not a fence you would typically see on a farm, other than maybe in a very small yard or something like that. But it's a fence that served its purpose, and we arrived at this design through this kind of a conversation. Often we can take the institutionality out of a fence by doing something like this at a corner up by the house or by the end of the driveway. Typically what will happen is that there will be a flower garden will appear here. In the next year or so, then maybe a sign, a farm sign will show up there. All it does is just takes, like I say, that plain normal fence and makes it into something a little more decorative that's easier to look at every day. Sometimes we'll combine different kinds of fence. In this case, we've got a board fence on the side that faces the road and the side that faces the buildings. And then down the two sides, the opposite sides, we've got wire fence. A little less expensive and just as practical as far as this purpose goes. This is what they call the flex fence. It's something that's evolving over the years. But what it is in fact a polymer-coated high-tensile wire. It replaces that board fence that you would see there. Comes in different colors, takes a lot less maintenance. So again, you've got to ask yourself, how much do you want to put into your fence over the years as well? This is one we did in Cambridge. It's actually bamboo. You buy it in mats, you build the frame, roll the mats out, and screw it up to the frame. It makes a really nice kind of a barrier, again, between the properties, and about less than 50% of the light gets through. So you don't really have to see what your neighbors are up to. Or maybe you can't see what your neighbors are up to, depending on your point of view. And sometimes it's a simple fence like this, just a rail fence. All that does is delineates the property, reminds one neighbor where the other neighbor's property starts. Often we get into situations where there are safety considerations, whether handling the livestock, containing livestock, or safety concerns more for the people that are handling the livestock. Particularly if you get into a situation with cattle or sheep where you want to be handling them a lot, weighing them often to see how your gains are coming along, or maybe in a processing situation. So here's what we would typically do is to build a corral to keep the livestock safe on the inside and the people safe on the outside. Go with cedar posts, keep them 5 to 5.5 feet high, and spike other cedar posts right onto the side of it. That way everybody can operate within their own space with a great deal of safety. We just get different designs, and gates are another thing we need to worry about a little bit because we are using those gates to pressure those animals from one paddock to another. And here's one where we've just built a long race into it so that the animals can actually be processed right in the race if necessary, or loaded on or off the trailer, which is the end that we're standing on there. A little simpler. In this case, we had to fence some kids out of a construction zone. So again, took a horse fence, adapted it for something that would be practical for them as well. In this case, keeping dogs away from a yard. So every fence has got its purpose, whether it's that stone fence you saw at the beginning of the presentation, or something like chain link, or something like a simple electric wire. They all have their purposes, and their purpose is specific to your property and your needs. The conversation cycles around, how do we make it the best one that it can be? Okay, so we'd like to carry on a bit this afternoon about a couple more aspects that Josh started with this morning. Primarily, when we start working further and further into each of these projects, we get talking about how to make them more efficient and work better. And often the subject comes up of rotational grazing. The first thing we have to decide is whether or not it's a good idea. And Josh mentioned this morning that in some applications, it's not necessarily that good of an idea. If what you're looking for out of your pastures is a really nice high average daily gain, then rotationally grazing your pastures won't give you that. Okay, so if you're going to compare your numbers with the guy in the feedlot who's pumping the feed to those cattle, and he's looking at a 2 or a 3 or a 5 ADG, by the time you've got your by the time you got your pasture system set up and you're very efficiently grazing your pastures in a rotational sense, you're losing out on your ADG. Now you're going to have a really phenomenal gain per acre by doing it the right way. But you're not going to have a really high ADG because you've removed that possibility for that animal to selectively graze. So I'll show you a diagram in a bit about not a typical system, but a system that I worked with back when I was custom grazing. But it's a question you got to ask yourself is what do you want out of that system? What do you want out of that pasture? Another question that comes up often is how intensively should I rotationally graze? How small of a paddock should I make? And again, it's a question that has to be answered very personally because you have to decide how much time you have to put into the system. In the 1990s, I did a lot of work with Wally Shouse across the road here, excuse me, on his grass farms up this way. And I remember specifically on one 150-acre farm, we made 17 paddocks for him. Now, next year, we went back and we ripped out half of the fences because they simply did not have the time to manage each of those small paddocks the way that they should have been managed. They had too many farms on the go, too many cattle on the go. So for them, in that situation, larger paddocks were better. Their average daily gains actually went up because the cattle did some selective grazing, and their manager wasn't pulling his hair out trying to keep all of these farms managed properly. Again, how do you measure your success? Are you producing pounds of gain, lambs per acre? Are you producing some milk in the tank? Each of us measures our success with the system differently than the guy beside us. And again, getting back to the original point, if we're grazing annual crops, that sort of one-time shots, then chances are going through and rotationally grazing those crops, even while they're there for that short period of time, is not a very practical thing because the investment you make in that is fairly significant. Whereas an annual crop, you're really just looking at a one-time hit, get that crop off, maybe run them back and forth a couple of times, but getting the most out of it as you go. And compare that with a long-term pasture that Jack's going to talk about establishing here in a few minutes. If you've got a long-term pasture, you can afford to, and you will benefit from putting up a semi-permanent rotational system, which you can then subdivide with a simpler system. So with rotational grazing, looks very much like Josh's picture this morning. It's what we're really trying to avoid, excuse me, is having this grass here in the foreground and there in the background, sitting there taking up space and doing absolutely nothing for us. If that grass had been kept vegetative, been clipped either or grazed, then it would still be productive. And as Josh mentioned this morning, those are the solar panels. Those are the things that are gaining you that energy, making use of the energy that's hitting your farm. This is kind of the look that we're going for. Mid-season, those cattle are walking through grass that's probably 14 inches high, taking the best off the top. Josh mentioned that 40%, 50% range, which is ideal, considering the root growth of the plants. Much happier cattle. You don't have that grass in their eyes, causing pink eye and all sorts of stress. This is a system that I worked with for a few years back in the 90s. Paddocks 1 to 5 were actually a 40-year-old straight tall fescue pasture, just as dense can be. And paddocks 1 and paddocks 5, there and there, were both very high ground. And those are my sacrifice paddocks. I had that flexibility built into the system so that if it got too much rain and it got too wet, I could stick the cattle on those two paddocks and they could do a little bit of damage, but not damage the whole system as itself. Or if it got too dry, the same thing. I had a couple of areas that I could put those cattle and feed them to keep them going until the rain started again. But those two areas were a bit of flexibility that I had built into the system. Paddock 6 to 11, 12 acres of hayfield that just got kind of old and tired. And instead of plowing it up, I started renovating. I added back white clover and trefoil and a few different grasses and really brought them up into a good pasture as well. Did the same thing with paddocks 12 to 15, and then a few years later did paddocks 17 to 19. The blue line that runs up through the center is a water system. I'll talk about water systems in a couple of minutes here. But each and every one of those paddocks had access to water, so the cattle could be out and locked out all day, not instead of coming back to the barnyard to drink. So they're always there with the feed all the time. If I wanted to subdivide those paddocks, I could, just with a little bit of temporary wire and step-in posts, so I could build that flexibility again into the system. Most often, though, I just, just kind of left the semi-permanent fences in place and worked through the rotation. Again, Josh mentioned this morning about rotations and how you need to be aware that the rest period is far more important than the duration that they were in that one paddock. When I would start this system with cattle, there's about 65 acres. I was running about 110 cattle on the 65 acres. And in the springtime, we used to like to get the cattle started late April, early May at the very latest. So as soon as there's a little bit of grass showing up on the hilltops, that's when I would start them out there and get them used to that fresh feed coming in. I'd still support them with a bit of dry hay as well, but until the pastures really got going, they would just stay in those first few paddocks. Average time through the 19 paddocks in the first part of the year was about 20 to 24 days. The average time through those paddocks by mid-July is about 47 days, 40 to 47 days. It really slowed them down and really forced them to get as much as they could out of each of those paddocks. But again, the important thing through all of that was that that grass had 40 to 47 days to rest before they had access to it again. Again, this is kind of a semi-permanent system. We've got a live high tensile fence around the sheep and then 2 wires or 3 wires, excuse me, for the semi-permanent divisions. So those would go up on fiberglass posts and those would stay in place for the duration of that pasture. The sheep would simply rotate around through the system. It's Bill McCutcheon's hand hanging onto a turnip plant. He loves grazing his annual plants, his annual crops. That's what the turnips look like after the sheep have been through one time. They come back in, they'll finish off those tops, and the third time through, they'll start eating the turnips right out of the ground. You're left with all these little cups. Josh also mentioned this morning about being the talk of the coffee shop. Bill just loves putting his sheep into the corn because he says he gets calls and he gets people coming up the driveway and he knows he's stirring something up. But he gets like literally thousands of grazing days per acre, sheep grazing days per acre when he puts them in the corn. So it's all a matter of different perspectives, right? We all have a system that we expect to work. We all have a system that works properly for us. But what's right for me may not be right for the next guy. Again, that's getting on in September. You see those cattle are still walking into 12 to 14 inches of grass. Sorry. And typically we could expect between 5 and 650 pounds of gain per acre in a good year with a good bunch of cattle. We had some hilly ground up there too. That's why the system works so well for me. So that's the quick on rotational systems. Any questions? Should we carry on? Keep going. So let's talk a little bit about alternate watering systems. What we're really trying to avoid is exactly that. The erosion around the edge of the dugout or the pond or the creek, the problems with water quality. And quite frankly, the cattle drinking there are always ingesting bacteria and things that aren't working in their favor. The simplest system on any installation would be to use an existing pressure system, say from the house, from the barn, or from the shed. Whether it's a hydrant like that we could tap into to put water on the grass, or even something just off the edge of the house. A lot of people have those. The most important thing to see right there at the top of the hose and right here is the vacuum breaker assembly. If you don't have one of those in place and the power goes off, there's potential for the water in the trough to feed all the way back, siphon all the way back into your well and contaminate your well. So you always want to make sure that one of those is in place, either in the system or something that you add at some point in time. And all it does is it injects air back into the system if the water starts to drop back through your pump. Try that one. Different systems require different sizes of pumps and power. We figure that out by calculating the demand every day on the system. So for a rough figure, we figure the average cattle beast needs about 10 gallons of water a day through the grazing season, and a sheep needs about 5 gallons of water a day. So with those numbers times the number of animals there, we can figure out what size of a system we need to put into place. We also need to calculate in the lift and the distance from the pump to the trough, because we have resistance in the lines and we have resistance from gravity. And we also have to figure out, is this a seasonal system or a year-round use? Will help us determine whether it's something that, where the water is available all the time in a trough, or whether we just bring it up out of the ground when the cattle or the sheep need it. Components in the system, we're talking about the power source, whether it's hydro or solar, the two main ones. We talk about a way to store the power so that it's available to pump at night and when it's cloudy. The pump, style of the pump and the size of the pump vary from one aspect to another. Then the tank or the trough that the water ends up in. So on the top there, you see the solar panels. We're collecting a bit of solar. This is back in the 90s, so those are probably only about 60-watt panels. Below that, you see a voltage regulator, which will keep an eye on the batteries and make sure that the batteries don't get overcharged. Again, for the most part, in the last 10, 20 years, we've been using a lot of lead-acid batteries, flooded batteries they're called. These are deep cycle 6 volts. So in a 12-volt system, we need 2 of those hooked up in series. Beyond the batteries, we've got the regulator that senses the switch position, whether the system needs water put in it or whether it's okay. And then in this case, we've got a pump sitting in a dugout. So it's an impeller style of pump, almost like a bilge pump. They come sometimes with a float attached, and sometimes you just take the float off and let them sit below the surface. And that's what you get. Everything's working right. You see the float switch in this situation. The switch is down, so the pump is turned on. As that tank fills up, the switch will move to the upwards position, open the relay, and the pump will shut off. This was an interesting shot because water was available to the cattle already. When we put this system in, about 2 days later, all of the grass around that cement slab was completely worn out because the cattle were choosing the fresh water in the tank over the fouled water in the pond. So there is a natural tendency even within the animals. I mean, we know it instinctively that we know it that they need fresh water, but they know it instinctively as well, that the fresher water is better for them than the fouled water. There's the float in the upward position, and the pump turned off, the water stopped. One of the critical things about the position of the panels is that they face south from this part of the world, and also that they operate between a 35 and a 45 degree angle. That's if you're going to set them in place and leave them for the season that catches the most amount of sunlight for the longest period of time. If it's something that you want to move, and you're out there every day, then you can adjust that between about 35 degrees upwards to 35 degrees downwards. You get a much longer use of the system, springtime and into the fall. There again is another system. Like I said, there's different styles of pumps that you can use. That's the end of an impeller style of pump. And they really don't function very well if we've got an open source of water, like a creek or a pond or a river, because there's too much sediment in our water. If you're putting one of those down a deep well, they work perfectly. It's a nice clean water to be bringing out of the well. Again, you see the batteries and in a system that is not open, like that's what you would call an open system, because there's no pressure builds up, or very little pressure builds up in the system. This is a closed system, so we've added a pressure tank to make sure that we can get water pushed to the far end with a decent amount of flow. That's one of the best styles of pumps I think I've ever run across. A lot of you will actually have them in a barn somewhere or in the basement of the house. They're a very old style, but it's a piston pump. But you can pump just about anything with those things and generate upwards of about 60, 70 pounds of pressure and about 150 feet of lift which is more than most of our pastures would need. And there is another old piece of equipment. It's called an aquamat or a pasture pump. And it's just a very shallow dish of water. And as the cattle drink their way into it, they push on the piston, which lifts the diaphragm and draws water from whatever the source is. Again, you can handle a fair bit of sediment in that, but over time you get some damage to the diaphragm. So you like to keep a foot valve and a screen on the end of that kind of a system too. But no power required. Cattle do all the work. In fact, I think one of those aqua pumps, or aquamats, that they say can water up to about 20 head of cattle.